Hey guys, this is Dr. Hurd back again for today's Victorian lecture from the Victorian period. This is 1832 to about 1901. 1901, 1900s, turn of the century is considered sort of late Victorian, called Edwardian by some people. But some of the things that were referenced in our previous lecture on the Romantics continue, and some kind of come to a head in the Victorian period. So let's dive in. Again, the Industrial Revolution, as we've talked about quite a bit, and we're seeing in Frankenstein, was kind of a reliance on science and technology and all of the equipment that was beginning. We see here, especially in the Victorians, a shift away from sort of God's spirituality, which is a contrast from the Romantics, which were very much about childhood wonder, transcendence, and spirituality. Now, later, because we have all these technological advances and these medical advances, we see the Industrial Revolution in full force, and many things that change because of that. Some of the advances, just to mention, were Jethro Tull's seed drill, the Rotherham plow, threshing machine, and so basically people were obsolete when they were working on farms. Machines could do the work of 20, 30 men in some cases. So they migrated to cities where they could work and get work. And their children could work too at the time. Again, they were unaccountable, and we mentioned this in the previous lecture. But factories at the beginning were very much laissez-faire, unaccountable for the working conditions. Again, as workers performed jobs for 16 hours or more a day. Again, no relief, no breaks, using a toilet that is basically a bucket. You're not allowed to leave your workstation for any circumstances. Children were also working hard in factories. Many of them supported large families. Even Charles Dickens worked in a factory starting at age 12 to help pay for debts his father incurred. Charles Dickens gained so much popularity in the Victorian period, and mainly because he did have this great rich versus poor dichotomy in his books. You think of things like Great Expectations and David Copperfield, and there were Pickwick Papers. There's a whole lot of sort of making fun or satirizing the rich and the wealthy and the affluent and the aristocratic, and that came from personal experience, because Dickens's father was thrown into debtor's prison, and was not able to, support his family. So Charles, at age 12, began working in a tar factory. It's basically when you flip your shoe over, there was tar on the bottom of your shoe. So he was a tar blackener. He would, get that tar ready for the shoe. I mean, that was his job at age 12, as you can imagine, and he was the breadwinner at that early age. But it gave him a lot of early perspective on how social classes worked, and it's something that he used to his great advantage later as a writer and a journalist. He was also a journalist on many cultural and social changes in the Victorian period. So oftentimes the children became the breadwinners, yes. And in 1832, the lower class slowly began to gain a voice when the first Reform Bill gave some of the population more representation in Parliament. But yeah, in the meantime, lots of kids and not a lot of money. The roots of police science, I just wanted to mention this, is really interesting. Sir Robert Peel established the first police force in 1829 in the Metropolitan Police Act. So he had 17 divisions, including 4 inspectors, 144 constables. We see this sort of shift in things like the popularity of Sherlock Holmes, right, and Scotland Yard. those sort of in the Victorians loved horror and thrillers, and so there's a lot of crime, and then there's a lot of police involvement due to the crime. So as those changes, as we set up a police division in places like Scotland Yard, which you can see in London when you go, in came a very sort of neat and interesting way of disciplining the public. These early policemen were called peelers or bobbies, and they only carried a truncheon, which is like a stick. As you probably know, or maybe you don't, Europeans do not are not Second Amendment. Folks, you cannot have a gun. You cannot own a gun in the UK. So a lot of their police officers do not carry guns. They carry bobby sticks. And they were seen, and they are characterized in novels and such as sort of the bullies, or these arrogant sort of pushovers in some of the books, especially when your protagonists are poor, and then they they're caught for loitering or possibly stealing or whatever, and so then the policeman also becomes sort of in the old days sort of known as a pushover. Back then, not always, but in some instances, I mean Dickens especially, had some really interesting characters, and had a lot of run-ins with being a poor kid. So, but yeah, even to this day they do not carry guns unless you get near the palace. Okay, if you get near the palace, they carry big guns. They don't even play, okay, when it comes to the monarchy over there. You get near the palace, you will see guns. Trust me. Big guns. But other than that, you usually won't. 1833, the persistent struggle to gain healthy working conditions ended, finally. Better working conditions. 1833 was a great year in Britain because not only were workers given better working conditions, but also slavery was abolished, okay? It took America 33 or more years, whatever, before 32 years, before in 1865, by the end of the Civil War, before we gave it up, we literally had a war over it. But Britain was able to work out some conditions. If you recall from 112, we read Heart of Darkness, and that discussed some of the issues they had with imports, exports, their sort of poor reception of non-native people. So even though slavery was abolished, there were still issues of prejudice, certainly. But at the time, the actual trade itself was illegal. So this is Queen Victoria. She was crowned in 1837. Birth of the urban, with the large influx of people into the factory towns, the population just exploded in London. Exploded. Large, uncomfortable housing units were built to accommodate the rapidly growing families. These housing units represented terrible living conditions. They were technically slums, where you had 10 to 12 people in a room, okay, and 2 toilets for every 250 people. Ew. Okay. There are stories from Victorian England where, a lot of times bathrooms weren't available, so they would go in a chamber pot. A chamber pot's just a big ceramic pot that you pee in. Okay. And then in the morning, you stand outside your window. You stand inside your window, excuse me. You don't stand outside your window, you'd fall. You stand at your window and then just dump it into the street. So there are, in the slums particularly, there are people who've written, and Dickens himself as a journalist, wrote about sort of walking through London at night. There would just be like feces, out in the street, out in the middle of walkways and stuff, because people were dumping all their chamber pots into the street because they didn't have anywhere else to dump it. They didn't have toilets, and or anything like that. At the time, it was just too many people. This is kind of where over time we developed, places that were not as safe. A lot of these places around the factories, or a lot of people, didn't have to live near a factory. You could take transportation, but like you had, issues where you had sections that were not as safe. And this is where a lot of crimes like Jack the Ripper and stuff would start happening, is in these sort of rundown places. Along with the ban of slavery and improved working conditions, they expanded the electorate, or people who can vote, was expanded to include working class men. Yay! William Lovett, and he's the founder of the London Working Men's Association, drew up a People's Charter in 1838 to reform government policy. Also, women were allowed to attend universities, 1848. That's right. Not quite 200 years ago, women were finally allowed to go to school. Free grammar schools were established, trade unions were legalized, and public sanitation was improved. As a side note, women could attend universities in 1848, but they were not allowed to take degrees, particularly in England, till about the 1920s, 1930s. It took another several decades for you to actually receive a real diploma for your studies. You could absolutely attend as a female, but you could not get the recognition or the degree. You could just audit classes, essentially, that you couldn't have the degree. So here we go. We're learning some stuff from that old French Revolution that we saw earlier in history. We're opening the working class up to have more participation in government and policy. And we also have the working conditions that were improved. We had more people making money, and so we now have a middle class. Most experienced social and financial mobility for the first time. If you were born poor, you usually stay poor. So if you think about the chimney sweeper, right, from Blake's poems, if you were a chimney sweeper, your dad was a chimney sweeper, guess what you're going to be? A chimney sweeper. That's what you're going to be. Unless you wanted to do, scoop horse poop. I mean, there's just, you would, if you were a male student, if you were a male son or whatever, you would probably just, just work under your father, right? And then take over his business or whatever. So, take over his jobs. That was pretty much, because, where are you going to get training? Where are you going to get education? You can't have either at the time. You couldn't really be educated unless you had money. So, for the first time, money was actually becoming an influx in more than just the aristocratic pockets, and so we actually had a middle class emerge. This was also interesting because that middle class included women who were trained to read, who read novels. So at the time, we see the rise of women writers like Jane Austen, like the Bronte sisters, and like George Eliot, whose name is Mary Ann Evans. That's her real name. She wrote under a male pseudonym. So we have all of these great women writers who, for the first time, are being allowed to publish. Now, the Brontes published under male pseudonyms, as did George Eliot. Jane Austen did not put her name on her first book, or first two books, I think. And until she gained popularity, she's like, ta-da, I'm a woman. So at that point, people were already warming up to women authors. So that was also becoming something important that was changing in the times. So Thomas Babington Macaulay here, you look at this gentleman. He preached the ideology of progress in England. He stated that history meant progress, and progress largely meant material improvement that could be seen and touched, counted, and measured. And he admired cleanliness and order, so probably wouldn't want to visit the slums anytime soon. Macaulay wanted to rid the streets of the slums and separate the affluent neighborhoods from the poorer ones. He also wanted everyone to be literate, enabling them to read signs and do basic reading. Macaulay often met with skepticism, but he reflected the perspective of the emerging middle class. Many of these values are values that we see now in American, even though at this point we had already broken off, right, from England. This sort of progressive thinking about sort of allowing everyone to vote, allowing not just landowners and rich people, allowing women access to education, allowing poor people access to education, making sure literacy is, an absolute necessity, for every person, not just people who can afford it. These were ideas that really shaped us as a nation even early on, but they were now sort of warming up to those ideas in England. So, despite the upswing with the Industrial Revolution, poverty and hunger still haunted Europe. Ireland especially suffered what we call the potato famine. They called it the Hungry 40s back then, about 1845 to 1849, in which potatoes rotted in the ground and robbed thousands of sustenance. The potato was a pretty big staple of Irish and English diet in the 19th century. So when they had a huge famine and none of the potatoes could be grown, it really put a damper. Over 1 million died and 2 million immigrated to America. In Ireland, there was a really nasty deal, but probably a lot of us are here because of it. That year, during the Hungry 40s, years, many of the Irish people had ancestral land, right? Land that was been passed down for generations and generations, and all of a sudden it was not fruitful. It was not providing anything. So usually what some government officials decided to do was to offer the family tickets to America in exchange for the land. No money, just a ship ticket to America. And that's it. And it would be enough, if it was 2 people or 7 people in your family, whatever, you would only get the ticket and the clothes on your back. But you would lose that land that's been in your family for generations. And a lot of people were forced to make really hard choices during this time and give up their ancestral land so they can immigrate to America and start over. I don't know a whole lot about my family specifically, but I do know that my ancestors, some of them, because I'm a Sullivan, by my maiden name is Sullivan, so I'm Irish, and they came over in the 1840s when we traced it back. So there was a lot of people, like me included, whose family came, because there was just nothing else they could do at this point. You can't be a farmer when there's nothing to grow, when the farm when they won't give it up. The same thing happened in America, if you recall, in the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. Land was just abandoned, because people had to move elsewhere because they couldn't grow anything. So that happened to a lot of Irish people migrated to America at that point. Victorianism, since I defined romantics for you, this is kind of what Victorianism is. It's to describe the prudery and gentility that characterized the Victorian age. Many were obsessed with eloquence, restraint. They viewed this as a moral and intellectual progression. Women were opulently dressed, while the men were also preoccupied with perception and social mobility. Men were still the authority, and women were fighting to gain a voice. Again, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot, were all used million pseudonyms to publish their work. Because, especially the Brontes, I've read a couple different wonderful biographies on the Brontes, and they worked insanely hard to get published, and basically had to use these never visited, a publishing office until their books had already been picked up for publication. And at that point, they were selling so well, you couldn't turn the money down if you were, a publishing business, right? But, we see this a lot in Victorian movies and just, Pride and Prejudice and things like that. This world where people were obsessed with how they appeared to other people, with their perception in society. It still happens today. It just happens on social media instead, right? My life is perfect. Everything's perfect. Blah, blah, blah. Same thing. Humans never change. we are, we're still obsessed with, perfectionism, but now we just put it on a device instead of show up at a ball with our, having spent our last money on a dress or whatever. So again, I had talked previously in the romantic lecture about we're going to start seeing a shift from these very religious people to this sort of leaning on scientific discovery and technology, and sort of a bigger shift into scienceism. I don't know what you call it, secularism, I guess. So the thirst for intellectualism emerged, and a religious war erupted when Charles Darwin, who's on the left there, published The Origin of Species in 1859. And that book suggested the theory of evolution and omitted the idea of a higher power. As you can imagine, many preachers and religious figures were livid at this, at this theory. Many were angry with Darwin for contradicting their religious beliefs. Thomas Huxley, he's on the right here, was a scientist who lectured about the necessity of scientific education using the analogy of a chess game with the universe. So in other words, instead of just accepting the universe as it is, sort of seeing the universe as controlled by rules, and things like gravity, and sort of, instead of just feeling like all of it is just this magic way that things work, and sort of understanding how things work. It's important to note, just from a interesting side point, that Charles Darwin may have written these things, but if you ever go to London and to Westminster Abbey, he is buried there. He is buried in the church, alongside many figures of not all of them, but a lot of the old monarchs and stuff. Westminster Abbey has tons and tons of old kings and queens buried there, and many people are honored there, including Charles Darwin. He's there too. So a lot of people say, why would he say God didn't exist and then they bury him in chapel? But there are some things that perhaps he, maybe he was just presenting a theory. Maybe he did believe in God, and just felt like God used this strategy to do things. There's also like an old rumor that he had a deathbed confession. I can't confirm that. I'm not up much on Charles Darwin, but anyway, Charles Darwin's book did a whole lot of damage, and we'll see in the sections that we read about how some of the poets and religious figures were dealing with I guess how science was sort of overtaking religion, and testing and challenging their long-held beliefs, their long-cherished beliefs. Speaking of science, though, and technology, this is Joseph Swain, and he installed the first electric lights in 1880, the fruition of an effort started by Ben Franklin. Pretty neat. And as you remember, Ben Franklin had the key on the kite and all that, and then eventually you had, sort of the war between sort of creating electricity, sort of discovering electricity between folks like Edison and Tesla and all that. So the first electric lights were 1880. If you can imagine, at this point they were just basically, if they were up at night, they were using candles. And a lot of people read at night by candlelight. John Milton, the poet, actually went blind because he read at candlelight so much it destroyed his vision. So electric lights, I'm sure, were welcomed. Another great movement during this time is the Pre-Raphaelite art movement. Pre-Raphaelite artists were the rebels of the art world. They included folks like John Everett Millay, Edward Burne-Jones, William Hunt, Dante Rossetti, and John William Waterhouse. He is my favorite. Waterhouse is my absolute favorite artist. I have a couple of his pieces hanging up in my own house. This group was called the PRB, and they were dissatisfied with Victorian complacency and mirrored the work of medieval painters, those before the Renaissance painter Raphael. So, founded in 1848, the group was seen as resisting the contemporary art movement, the art school dropouts. And although the movement ended in 1853, it didn't really last very long. The artists are still making a formidable impact on the world of art. Absolutely. You still see pre-Raphaelite art all over the place, not just at my house. There's a lot of great work that was done. Probably one of the most famous ones is the John Everett Millay painting of Ophelia, where she's laying in Ophelia from Hamlet, where she's laying in surrounded by flowers. That painting, the model for that woman, was laying in what was like an old school bathtub, right? And supposedly she almost got sick and died because she had to lay in the water so long. She was wet. She was wet to the bone for hours. Letting him paint this picture. But it became one of the most famous pieces of the time, definitely. Another side note on ethics. Utilitarianism was a philosophy that demanded the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. So Jeremy Bentham, this is this gentleman here at the top, and later James Mill, who's there on the bottom, carried this philosophy to the masses. Many thought that this was an excellent system of ethics and morality, but unfortunately it often fostered apathy. Remember laissez-faire? And excluded the marginal people who were not included in the greatest number. Now, on this type of ethical system, you could say, well, I can kill Hitler, for example, if I'm living in the 1940s. If I killed Hitler and that prevented millions and millions of deaths, then it is not wrong for me to kill Hitler. Right, just to give an example of that. Okay, that's just saying hypothetically. If you preemptively did something that and knew it was going to save all these people, then you do that. But then where's the where's the humanity in killing one person, right? If it's bad, it's bad. It's Kant's categorical imperative. If it's wrong regardless. So Jeremy Bentham, this guy right here. You're like, oh, look, there he is with his little hat. And and here he is today. That's right, folks. He's stuffed. And he's sitting, I think, at University College in the UK. He had himself stuffed. And that's him and his hat there. That's him. They said he never misses a meeting. And he sits in residence at the college. Taxidermied. That's right. All right, next. The Battle for Aesthetics and Structure. This is Matthew Arnold. We're going to be reading a little bit of him. He wrote this essay called Culture and Anarchy, How Utilitarianism, which is what we just talked about, affected the lives of Victorian. He states that Hellenism, this has come from the Helen of Troy, okay, is that movement, sort of like the art and beauty and aesthetics, right? So very echoed in the Romantics. Was the spontaneity of consciousness, while Hebraism, which is rules systems enforced by puritanical religion and utilitarianism, was the strictness of conscience. Hellenism is the heart, and Hebraism is the head. So it's really trying to balance emotion with rationality. Okay. That has been, for many artists and poets, a real struggle. So basically he says, don't go too much one way. If you go too much one way, then you sort of neglect the other. Again, here's good old Charles Dickens. Chuck Dickens, as some people say. I don't call him Chuck. I think that's weird. David Copperfield, Oliver Twist, and A Christmas Carol. Oliver Twist is another great book by him. I love his stuff. It's very caricatured, okay? If you're looking for nuanced people, don't go to Dickens. But he did it purposely so that he could use satire, wit, irony, to really show the problems in society. So he also poked fun at the aristocracy as well as the rigid structure of British schools. Yes, he had in Bleak House, I think there's a gentleman who runs. He's a schoolmaster called Chokum Child. That's his actual name, is Chokum Child. That's his name. As if you don't think too hard on that one. Again, throughout Victorian period, poets and authors express skepticism, question authority, beliefs, and ideals. This is left over from some of the Romantics, surely. Many writers still reminiscing about the flavor of the Romantics endorsed transcendentalism, which is a connection between earth and heaven, body and soul, material and ideal. And poets such as Matthew Arnold reflected this idea in his poem Dover Beach, and we will read that. So, again, very similar themes to what we have seen already, but keep in mind that we're still coming out of these changes that were brought by the the Romantic period. So we still have a lot of change and instability, sort of, and people sort of trying to. When there's a shift in culture, there is a period of unrest, right, and settle. And we still see people trying to settle at this point and find some new normal. So there they are, the fabulous Victorians. I love the Victorians. Love reading Victorian literature, not just British, but Russian as well. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Gogol. I mean, they're just great writers. But that's all. We will hit some of these themes throughout the literature. And that's all I have today. So you guys have a great day. I'll see you soon.